Children sometimes pick on each other's differences. It is, after all, a pretty good way of being nasty. But overwhelmingly, children show us that they long to bridge differences, whatever they are, and assert the one thing that they really care about: being children.
I believe that anti-racism is disabling a generation of children. Inadvertently, we're teaching them that race and physical differences like skin colour really matter. Increasingly multicultured, multi-ethnic and mixed, this is the generation that has the unique opportunity to transcend race. But instead of encouraging this process, anti-racism celebrates race, exaggerates difference, and casts children as either victims or victimizers. I say, leave the kids alone.
I'm Adrian Hart, and for over 20 years I've lived and worked in East London. As a teacher, and more recently as a filmmaker, I've worked in dozens of schools across London and the South East.
When I first came here in the 1980s, racism was an everyday occurrence. Back then, attacks on black and Asian people were frequent. Racist murder was frequent. Today, everyday racial tensions are far less in evidence. Britain is more diverse and more tolerant than it's ever been before.
Despite the fact that things have improved, the belief that racism is as bad as it ever was, or getting worse, remains commonplace.
I think it's worse now than it ever was.
Just as bad.
Getting worse.
Today, it's as though racism lurks beneath the surface, hides in our unconscious minds even.
Racism is completely unacceptable.
And what evidence we can find is often assumed to be the tip of the iceberg.
Whether it's a gobby-jay goodie or the faux pas of some Tory MP, once you cast something as the tip of an iceberg, the enormity of what lies below needs no proof. It's just there.
When Altab Ali was stabbed by racists in 1978, 10,000 Bengali workers took to the streets in protest. Anti-racism then meant those on the receiving end of violent attacks organising to protect themselves. It meant challenging a climate of racism, sustained by all of Britain's major political parties and institutions.
Today, with racism redefined as a social illness, official anti-racism has become the vaccine, and where better to start than schools?
But first, it helps to have some evidence. Step one, pump up the figures.
There's been a sharp rise in racist incidents in English schools.
They show just the tip of the iceberg.
Since 2002, the Race Relations Amendment Act has imposed a duty on schools to identify, record and report racist incidents. The definition schools are encouraged to use is: a racist incident is any incident perceived to be racist by the victim or any other person. Government guidelines remind schools that racism is all-pervasive. If they don't identify and report racist incidents, they are assumed to be ignoring racism and therefore condoning it.
With local authorities encouraging a zero-tolerance approach, it really shouldn't be any surprise that the figures are rising.
Step two, employ as many race experts, ethnic minority achievement officers and diversity coordinators as possible. Commission books and teaching packs, provide funding for awareness-raising drama workshops. Oh, and employ someone like me to make an anti-racist educational film.
Tripod, camera.
The title I was initially given for this film was Watch Out for Racism. Destined for Essex primary schools, it was commissioned to tackle the new problem of racism in schools. Our first task was to go into the schools and talk with children and teachers.
The first thing that became apparent was the singular lack of any evidence of racism other than the incident register itself.
Do you think there's racism in this school?
No, I think this school's quite a good school. Not really.
If anything, children were demonstrating an impressive model of diversity that could teach the adult world a thing or two. Harmonious incidents seemed to be breaking out with shocking frequency. But here's the twist. The second thing that became apparent was that the incidents being recorded were all of a verbal nature, and the majority of these were the result of playground spats between friends.
We sometimes forget the passions that get unleashed when children fall out. Insults get exchanged, and in the need to retaliate, they choose words precisely to cause maximum distress. It's nasty, they shouldn't do it, but they're children.
To develop, children need adults to take a step back. Through unsupervised play, they experience the consequences of conflict and kindness. If we start to police this space, we deny children the freedom to flourish.
I think teachers know very well that you don't judge children by adult standards, but with a legal duty to perform, they're under pressure. Take a look at this. You see here the government advice website, TeacherNet, is unequivocal. It says here people don't get murdered for being fat or having ginger hair. Insults like Paki are more serious. They go to the roots of someone's identity and sense of belonging and attack not only the individual child but also his or her parents and grandparents and the wider community and tradition to which they belong. Now that might seem reasonable. It might even seem racist to take a different view. But think about it. If you're convinced that society is rotten with racism and that rooting it out of children is the best way of tackling the problem, and if you also believe that a child's racial identity must be nurtured as a defence against the growing menace, then you have an intractable doctrine, one that conjures the past agonies of victims of racism and downloads this onto a new generation. I'm not arguing that targeted and persistent bullying doesn't exist. It does. Nor am I saying that when children are being persecuted, we shouldn't intervene. What I am saying is an erroneous brand of anti-racism is leaking into our schools.
The government may be engaged in a public relations exercise to show that it's taking racism seriously and appointing itself as the solution.
But what concerns me is the racializing effect this has on children. At every step, we're demonstrating that something called race really, really matters, and that skin colour really matters.
This is anti-racism in reverse. It embraces the racist lie that humanity can be further divided. In its determination to condemn racism, it redefines children's everyday interactions as acts of racism. It may promote the celebration of difference as a panacea for resolving prejudice, but once sealed into separate racial or religious boxes, all children get is a sense of separation, boundaries where there had been none before. It's not exactly the world Martin Luther King dreamt of 44 years ago. For him, colour blindness didn't mean racism blindness. It meant a goal. All those past struggles to resist and overcome racism, the gains that were achieved, should have brought that goal closer. Instead, official anti-racism paralyses King's dream, leaving only racial identity and racial awareness as an end in itself.
Is he there?
This should have been the generation that at least had a chance of breaking free of racial thinking, of constantly viewing the world through the prism of race.
When my son starts primary school, I hope that the interactions that he has with his friends continue to be based on the content of each other's character and the humanness that they all share. My fear is that he will become engulfed in an atmosphere of hypersensitivity and racial etiquette.
There is one development that may yet force some new thinking on this issue. Welcome to Britain's fastest growing minority group.
My dad was born in Africa, my mum was born in England, but I wish people would stop going on so much about skin colour. Get over it.